So you started with 3D structures.
Well, not really. What happened, there's 3Ds and two-dimensional work got mixed up in there. So early on, I went to LA Valley College where I studied under Fidel Daniele, who sent me to Cal Arts, but first to go see Dwayne Valentine and Larry Bell. I spent 3 days with Dwayne Valentine. And then I went to Cal Arts, and then I moved to Laguna Beach, and I broke my neck. I injured my neck severely, which put me out of making art or really processing and dealing with life altogether for quite a while. In 1980, after my first daughter was born, I decided to go back to school. So I got a Department of Rehabilitation to put me through school. Went to Saddleback to clean up all my GPA, and so then I went to UC Irvine. When I went to UC Irvine, one of my first instructors was Tom Jenkins, which I revere highly. And so you have an interview, and I brought my artwork, you know, John Lennon piece, different pieces like that, and he goes, you know, all of this is really nice and fine and well, but what I want you to do is I want you to take it home and forget about that you've ever made it, and then when you come back to school, I want you to start fresh. I want you to never think about that stuff again and start all over again. And I want you to start drawing squares. So I took him seriously. I came back and I started drawing squares, different shapes of squares, different squares and different realities, and stacking them and stuff. And I did that for over a year. And this is when I was doing the printmaking up in the top floor with John Paul Jones, because that's why I went to UC Irvine to enlist to apply, and I got a Regents Fellowship to work with JP. Well, we didn't get along that well. Anyway, I was doing the printmaking of all the squares. Well, finally, Tom goes, I want to see what you've been doing. So he goes, you're still doing squares? And I go, yeah, you told me to. So he goes, well, just do whatever you want now. So then I started thinking about the buildings. I started doing like All's Well on the Western Front. I started making buildings, and at the same time, I was making three-dimensional buildings. And all of that happened, the three-dimensional stuff happened when I was doing a painting of a teacup. And I was rubbing it and petting it, and a friend of mine, Marlo Bartels, said, what are you doing? And I go, well, I'm petting it. And he goes, well, why don't you just make a three-dimensional one? And that's when the first light went off that way. But I kept painting, and I made all the three-dimensional work. I made my first graduate show was all three-dimensional high-rises and submarines and coliseums and all of that sort of stuff. And then Melinda Wirtz was cramming. She was the director of the chair of the department at the time, I forget. She was cramming neo-expressionists down our throat. So I started painting on paper different things, but I always had these objects in there floating in the space, and like juggling concerns where the guy, it was me, I'm on one foot balanced, you know, barely balancing, and I'm juggling my life, because at that time with 2 children, trying to pay to go to school, pay the bills. So then I graduated, and I went to LA to work for my friend Chris Cheney. And then I came home, and Tom Jenkins hired me to be a sculpture instructor at UC Irvine. And I go, we have one problem here. We need you to make your work in the sculpture lab while you're teaching. Well, I tried to paint there, and you can't paint in the sculpture lab with all the dust and everything flying around. And plus, painting is a headspace, and it's about 80% of what you think about is what finally, the 20% is what finally winds up on the canvas. I really enjoyed painting, but I shifted drastically, totally 100% to making objects. And I was to make the teacup, but I started with the arias, because I started stacking those squares, and I had a I don't know what, a 5-second, 3-second epiphany. You know, what if I put all these squares on an axis and then run a random wave pattern through it? So I drew that all out, and it just was, I'm still trying to exhaust all the ideas from that. So what I did is I started making all of those pieces in all different, mostly construction, and then got a show in LA. I moved up there, moved to Santa Monica, Carol and I, and had a few shows, and then Chris Cheney gave me a stipend in 91 to 94, $2,500 a week, just to make art. That was one of the best times deadlines ever. I didn't have to think about making money. I just made art. And then the earthquake happened. Well, the motorcycles. The earthquake happened, so our studio got wiped out. We moved to Lincoln Place Apartments. Red Cross sent us there, and then I got a very small studio at the airport, right across from Barker Center. It was 333 square feet, one of the smallest studios I've ever had. But I really think to this date I've made one of the best bodies of work I've ever made. And then from there, just kind of went back to the studio where we were, that same property where the gardens are, up on Olympic and Colorado, between Colorado and Olympic and Cloverfield. And just kept working, got crazy. And then about 94 is when I really started making the resin be a staple of what I was doing. And the work became very organic. All this time I was making the grid pieces, not the grid pieces, but the diamonds, the squares that are fetish finished, they're highly polished. Those all started out as just being studies of what the wood would do over a structure. So I'd take a section, we're back to the squares again, I'd stamp a section in my mind out of a piece that I wanted to build, and I did that. Well, the crazy thing happened is those became very exciting, and they started paying for all the materials and everything. But I got really bored with them, and so that's when I made the first Madame X that was very organic, and the work really shifted towards the organic aspect after that, even to this point. But I just can't shake the hard edge squares, the diamonds, the squares, the really nice, because of the automotive background that I have, it's just too alluring to make a beautiful shape. So on an automobile, you have a clear coat that's just thousandths of an inch thick. Because of the UV, it'll just crack it. I can get the same effect, but just 1,000 times better with the pieces, because when I pour them in the molds, or I make them with a resin to begin with, I can have a clear coat of a half an inch. So what happens, and then you can start introducing color. So what happens with it is that as the light comes in, it's just like the strata and the clouds and stuff that we see in horizons, is that the light starts bouncing up and down and it illuminates the back of the levels. And that's why the work has that great luminescence about it, where you can see into it. So that's kind of where I'm at. And the structures, the wooden structures, I really like doing that. That's probably the most peaceful part of making it, because you conceptualize in your head, like I've always thought about, what if you could, because the universe, you think about it being so big and so little and everything, but what if you could actually hold it? What if you were able to hold it? So I've tried to create pieces that would be that, if you could hold it. It's exciting to be able to think of those possibilities of that. And then right now, I'm getting back. I started a body of work 2 years ago that's all biomorphic, and because of COVID, black. I didn't see any reason to celebrate, but there's that strain in me that can't make everything just black. So I put color in at the end, and then in certain angles you get to see the color. So it's still, they're alive, they're dark, but they're alive. And I made 27 structures, and I've completed 7 of them. I still have the 20 to do. And then I want to make a bunch of new stuff this summer. And that's how we got to this point.